Born into slavery in Missouri in 1811, Nancy Gooch has long been a symbol of how the black community in the free state of California worked to achieve a greater level of freedom and had to fight every step along that path. She came to California during the gold rush in a wagon train, but she was not permitted to ride in a covered wagon. She had to walk the entire way.
You may notice that I'm not buried here in this cemetery. You may also notice the lack of other Negroes in this cemetery. In my time, that's what we were called by the nice white folks. I'm Nancy Ross Gooch, and I was one such Negro in El Dorado County. Truth is, I'm not sure I would have been allowed to be buried here. No, not then. Not this cemetery. This cemetery was founded by a bunch of white, powerful men. And although there is no actual proof that colored folk could not be buried here, I'm sure it would have been frowned upon. In any case, we didn't ask. No, I found my final rest in the Pioneer Cemetery near my family home in Coloma. That's where I made my home after being brought here during the gold rush. My owner, Mr. Gooch, wanted to strike it rich, so he packed up all his belongings, myself included, and headed west with so many other folks during that time. There was no time to waste. Gold had to be found before somebody else found it. The insatiable greed of some men just never makes sense in my mind. Peter and I made the long trek from Missouri in a wagon train with our owner in about 1849 or thereabouts. Peter Gooch was, for all intents and purposes, my husband and Andrew's father, although slaves were not permitted to marry, so to the world we were just a couple slaves, and there was a baby slave somewhere thereabouts if he looked hard enough. Andrew, my son, my only son, was just 3 years old at the time, considered too young for the gold fields and too young for the journey, was left behind, sold to another family at 3 years old. They just took him away and gave him their name, Monroe. And Peter and I put in a wagon and made to leave him behind. I thought I'd never see him again. Could you be made to leave a young child behind knowing full well you'd never see him again? Just a baby. We survived the long journey and arrived in California not too long before California gained actual statehood. Now, slavery being illegal in California as a free state, my owner had little choice. We were free and also penniless. There was no stipend for freed slaves. We had to find work. Luckily, the miners, mostly unencumbered men who didn't care to cook and clean for themselves, would hire out cooking, cleaning, and mending and such when they could afford it. And I took job after job. During that time, there was no shortage of men looking for and finding gold, although oftentimes it was barely enough to live off of. Peter was a fair carpenter. He took jobs building much of what became a small community, a community that dwindled as fast as it grew as folks snatched up all the gold and moved on. We worked and we saved and we worked. In about 7 years or so, Peter and I, we finally got married. A year after we got married, we purchased a large parcel of land, and we worked that land, and we sold fruits and vegetables, a rare commodity that commanded top dollar. We kept working and saving and working and saving. Peter died a few years later, just before word came of the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, my only goal throughout all of this was to see my son again. Couldn't go back to Missouri, couldn't afford it. And traveling back to a state where slavery was still legal was not an option. There was a war going on where my baby was. There was nothing I could do. So I worked and I saved. All the while, lending an ear to hear of any news about the war being fought over slavery in the East. When the war did end a few years later, it appeared all the Negroes were free. Even my boy Andrew. Or so it seemed. Just like when Peter and I were free, the newly freed Negroes had nothing. All the owners found themselves without free labor and hiring workers to work those enormous tracts of land Well, that was impractical. So they divvied up the land and allowed the former slaves to rent out plots for a percentage of their crops or earnings from sales. The tenant farmers soon found that their earnings were not enough to stay out of debt to the landowner, so they found themselves trapped in a cycle of poverty. Better than being owned, but not quite as free as many had hoped. Now, Andrew, he married another free slave, Sarah, and had 2 boys on the tenant farm, Andrew Jr. and Pearlie, the first 2 in our family to be born free in God knows how many generations. As for me, I kept working and saving. I was all alone working and saving, working the land, working as a domestic, working and living for about 7, 8 years. When I was about to turn 60, a full 20 years after leaving my son behind and coming to this place, I finally saved enough money to pay off Andrew's tenant farm debt and to purchase 4 railroad tickets for he, his wife, and his 2 young sons. Months later, the moment that I had dreamed about for a good third of my life, the moment that I never quite allowed myself to believe would happen, happened. My son, my beautiful boy, a grown man now, stepped off that train and was held in his mother's loving embrace. I could have died right then and there, and I would have called that a happy story. Oh, Andrew Monroe. He had so much of his father in him. He was a doer. He was light and free and had big plans. No sooner did he step off that train did he start clearing the land, planting orchards, a vineyard, brought on some cattle, even a wheat field. His prowess in the field drew the attention of James Marshall. You know, the man that started it all? He was still around. Now, I'm not going to lie. It was a good time for our family. But things were not always so easy. Although abolitionists gravitated to California, and the mining camps turned towns were just a melting pot of folks from all over the world, people didn't like to see a Negro family so prosperous. They didn't like much a Negro landowner at all. And yet, we still continued to grow and thrive with the community. Now, Andrew believed highly in the power of education. He taught himself how to read and write, and he insisted that his children, my grandbabies, attend school. Edwin Markham, you know the famous poet? Well, he taught some of my grandbabies, believe it or not. Now, we didn't know he was going to be a famous poet at the time. To us, he was just Mr. Markham. You know his poem, The Man with the Hoe? Well, that was based on my Andrew. It was. And it's understandable to anyone who knew my boy. As I remember it, the opening goes something like this. Bowed by the weight of centuries, he leans upon his hoe and gazes at the ground. The emptiness of ages in his face, and on his back, the burden of the world. Who made him dead to rapture and despair? A thing that grieves not and that never hopes. Well, Andrew, as he matured, he could be a quiet and still man, as anyone who knew him would attest. Some say Markham wrote that poem about some painting. I don't know. That first part sure does remind me of Andrew. Now, Sarah and Andrew had a total of 6 grandbabies. Now, they all lived on and helped work the land. Some married and some prospered in other ways. Pearlie built the blacksmith shop, and he worked that trade for a while. Andrew had come to befriend James Marshall. And when Marshall died, my son and his boy Pearlie trekked Marshall's body back to Coloma and buried him in Coloma, where he pulled gold from the river all those many years ago. Pearlie became caretaker of Marshall's land, and the family eventually owned that and much more of the Coloma Valley. I lived the better half of my life a free woman, but I can't help but wonder what kind of life I would have lived had I lived an entire life free. I died in my 90th year, surrounded by a prolific family. I died proud. I died knowing that I had built something of a life for me and my family. I died free.